Welcome everyone. The presentation will begin shortly. This session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes with about 45 minutes of presentation, followed by time for questions and answers. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and turn off your cameras. If you have a question or comment, enter it in the chat during the presentation and it will be addressed during the question and answer period. You may also ask questions with video during the question and answer portion. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week of the live event. My name is Dr. Joshua Gordon, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. TESOL International Association Speech, Pronunciation, and Listening Interest section is pleased to present this webinar titled Applying Task-Based Language Teaching Techniques to Second Language Pronunciation Learning. Our speaker today is Dr. Ingrid Mora-Plaza, lecturer at the University of Barcelona. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, and now I'll hand it to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. So first of all, I am really grateful for the invitation to present at the TESOL International Speech Pronunciation and Listening intersection. I would also like to thank Dr. Joan Carles Mora and Dr. Roger Gilabert from the University of Barcelona for working hard hand in hand with me in this project, and also the Barcelona L2 Speech Research Group and the UB GRAL Group. So today I'm going to be talking about task-based language teaching and L2 pronunciation learning. So in this webinar, I will start presenting some L2 pronunciation learning challenges and the important role of attention and noticing for L2 pronunciation learning. Then I will present findings from pronunciation training and instruction, followed by the design and manipulation of tasks for second language development. And finally, I will talk about task-based pronunciation teaching, especially methodology and findings, and offer some materials and resources that teachers can use in the classroom. So we know that pronunciation is fundamental to communication. So without a reasonable level of phonological knowledge, comprehensibility might be affected, and this in turn can affect the speaker's relationship with the second language community. So in most cases, L2 speech production mirrors the nature of our developing L2 phonetic representations, which in fact are very sensitive to linguistic experience and also quantity and quality of L2 input, as you can see in this example. So misplacing lexical stress due to transfer of L1 stress assignment may lead to a lack of intelligibility. Now, research has shown that a major constraint in L2 speech learning is learners' inability to perceptually identify phonetic and phonological differences between L1 and L2. So when a pair of L2 sounds, like these two, are mapped into a single L1 sound category, and both of them are perceived to be equally similar or dissimilar to it, it's extremely difficult for learners to acquire the contrasting sounds. So the following sound positions that I'm showing carry high functional load. So English ash and wedge are very strongly simulated to our Catalan a, and the phonological contrast e is also very challenging because tense e is always perceived as Catalan e, but lax e can be assimilated to Catalan e or e. So as you can see, it's very hard for them to acquire. So in order to overcome this L1 interference, and of course for learning to take place, learners need extensive exposure to L2 input, and also to be able to notice and attend the relevant and critical acoustic features in the acquisition of a given sound. Now, despite the difficulty in developing learners' phonologic awareness in the L2, directing learners' attention to phonetic form through different phonetic training procedures and different instructional techniques has proved effective in developing learners' perception and also production at different proficiency levels and also different experience. So if L2 input is kind of limited and students, for example, undergraduates can have access to a lab, research has demonstrated that phonetic training is very effective at improving the perception, production, and also the lexical encoding of L2 sounds. However, most lab experiments are often conducted individually in very controlled lab conditions, and this makes the applicability of such research to the classroom quite difficult. So orienting learners' attention to these challenging phonetic forms can also be done through pronunciation instruction. From research, we know that pronunciation instruction plays a central role in improving learners' segmentals, suprasegmental features that enhance intelligibility, comprehensibility, and accuracy in the second language. So probably some of you have also noticed the effects that teaching pronunciation has on your students, not only on global measures of pronunciation proficiency, but also on the development of their listening skills, for example. So one way is through explicit instruction. Explicit instruction helps learners notice the difference between their own productions and those of more proficient speakers, and it has been shown to improve learners' pronunciation. However, it is usually a decontextualized focus on the accuracy of some specific forms, and teachers may not find the time to address pronunciation issues independently and also to decide what aspect of pronunciation should be the focus of instruction. Also, computer-assisted pronunciation learning and the use of automatic speech recognition programs, such as the English accent coach by Ron Thompson, help minimize these pronunciation accuracies. So one way of integrating pronunciation in the language curriculum is by using pronunciation form-focused communicative activities. In fact, Darcy et al. In 2019 showed that the inclusion of form-focused instruction with a communicative component actually generated more pronunciation gains than just form-focused instruction, and this did not detract them from the course learning goals. Now, outside the academy, Mark Hancock, for example, proposes a great variety of information gap, minimal pair discrimination games to teach difficult L2 sounds, which despite not having been tested in research, actually seem to raise learners' awareness about pronunciation. So researchers in the L2 pronunciation field agree that if there is a focus on phonetic form, learning of those forms may occur. Therefore, one proposed solution to this challenge that I've mentioned may be a systematic integration of pronunciation in content-based teaching at all levels of competence, taking into account the positive qualities of each one of the approaches that I have mentioned. So considering that input, noticing, and attention are very important and play a key role in language learning, one approach that has been shown successful for developing second language speech is task-based language teaching. So if we take this definition by Skian, a task is an activity in which meaning is primary. There is some kind of communication problem to solve. There is some sort of relationship to comparable real-world activities. Task completion has some priority, and the assessment of the task is in terms of outcome. So beyond the techniques that I mentioned before that actually drive a focus on pronunciation, TBLT advocates for a more natural approach where this focus on forms is not artificially imposed, but it is rather driven by design. So here, the goal is not the form itself, but actually dealing with the form in order to solve a communicative problem. So By doing this, learners can notice the gap between their own interlanguage and the target language or the language of more proficient learners. And this happens during meaning-based interaction. So they engage in negotiation of meaning, they can reformulate their hypotheses, and finally, hopefully, they can change their output production. So the role of task designers here is to manipulate tasks along their internal features, implementation conditions, in a way that we enhance the probability that these language learners will pay attention to particular aspects of the language, and this will encourage fluency, and of course, this will promote more accurate, more varied, more complex forms. So these reflections of form are observed in the form of language-related episodes, which are defined by Swain and Lapkin as instances where learners talk about the language that they're producing, they question their language use, or correct their own production. And they're seen and have been shown to be particularly important for language learning, and this is promoted by task-based interaction. So whereas decades of research on TBLT have demonstrated that task design and task manipulation may encourage L2 development, most research examining the facilitative role of tasks has focused mainly on CAF, which is complexity, accuracy, and fluency, and also in terms of specific language dimensions like grammar, vocabulary, and pragmatics. However, the fields of TBLT and L2 pronunciation instruction very rarely liaise. So considering that learners attending to phonetic form through different instructional techniques actually leads to improvement in learners' oral abilities, only very recently, some researchers working from the TBLT perspective have tried to investigate whether tasks and task design could be actually used to encourage such attention to pronunciation within meaning-based interaction. So after this TBLT colloquium that happened in 2015 on task-based pronunciation teaching, only a few exploratory studies investigated the effectiveness of tasks in drawing learners' attention to phonetic form during communicative task performance, and then how we could assess improvement in L2 pronunciation accuracy. So the studies that I will now introduce have manipulated the design of tasks to draw learners' attention to phonetics. So in these studies, Jung et al. In 2017 found that hearing and producing the same words containing target stress patterns repeatedly in communicative collaborative tasks was helpful in developing better control of lexical stress in English. Or for example, Lewin and Isbell showed that familiarity with one's own L2 accent may decrease the need for negotiation of meaning. Also, Parlak and Ziegler showed a very beneficial effect of recasts on learners' ability to notice the correct position of stress on target words, and also showed that the face-to-face participants noticed and were more likely to take advantage of this feedback provided than those through synchronous computer-mediated communication. And then some studies have investigated the benefits of manipulating task complexity in increasing linguistic accuracy. This is following Robinson's cognition hypothesis. So for example, Solon et al. Found that the more complex version of a task generated more accurate realizations of L2 Spanish vowels. And Gordon also found that learners who completed more complex tasks as part of their treatment ended up being more comprehensible at Posttest. So today, we'll be talking a little bit about this type of task manipulation. Moreover, learners' awareness to phonetic forms may be promoted through explicit feedback or recasts, as shown by the work by Saito and Lister, among others. But there are other visual techniques that we can use, such as input enhancement, input flooding, or task essentialness that have not been thoroughly investigated in relation to pronunciation. Only some subtitling studies have investigated them in relation to pronunciation. So in the study that I will present, we made the target phonological features be essential for task completion as a way to direct learners' attention to form and trigger pronunciation-based language-related episodes. So Sikola, Solon et al., Moran, Levkina, and others found that task-essential language in map tasks actually encourage the production of pronunciation-focused language-related episodes, but only Saito and Mora-Plaza investigated the effects of task essentialness in discussion and also in decision-making tasks. So now I will present my study on the effects of task essentialness on L2 pronunciation learning, but I will be mainly focusing on the methodology and the materials I use, and also how I manipulated tasks to enhance that focus on pronunciation. So to give you a little bit of context, this TBPT study was carried out by 92 participants, which were studying in a public high school close to Barcelona. 63 were part of the experimental group and 29 were the control group, which corresponded to 3 different intact classes. The numbers of males and females was balanced between the 2 groups, and they were all around 16 years old. So their L1 was Catalan and Spanish, but they clearly differed in the degree of dominance, considering themselves much more dominant in Catalan than Spanish. And they all had studied English as their L2 for approximately 10 years. So the pronunciation targets were 2 challenging English vowel contrasts for Catalan learners, which are the tense E, tense lax EE, and the open central ash wedge. So as for the design, this experimental group did a pre-test. They did a 7-week treatment, a post-test, and also a delayed post-test 11 weeks after the treatment. And the control group only completed the pre and post-test, but they did not do any pronunciation-based intervention until the whole experiment was over. So pre, post, and delayed post-test were identical, and they consisted of a battery of perceptual and production tasks, which they carried out individually. So the training phase took place in the usual English classroom, and this was carried out with a whole group of students 3 times per week. So learners dedicated the first 30 minutes of their English class to practice reading, listening, writing, use of English, etc. And then they they did oral tasks with me during the last 30 minutes. And also they carried out several proficiency, working memory, and attention tests individually. So the training stimuli consisted of 80 consonant vowel consonant words that came from 24 minimal pairs that contained these 2 target contrasts. The stimuli were half monosyllabic, half disyllabic, and we used 4 standard British English voices for the recordings in the pre-task phase. So the testing was made of 160 tokens, of which 84 were minimal pairs containing, again, these 2 vowel contrasts. Half of the items were trained, half of the items were untrained, and likewise, the number of monosyllabic and disyllabic words was balanced. So all these tokens were produced by 2 standard British English voices, which had not appeared during the training. So the context is very important in TBLT research and practice. So during 7 full weeks, participants were immersed in an end of the course trip to London. Tasks were organized in a sequential manner. So the first ones dealt with the planning and the arrival in London. And then the last task corresponded to farewell activities and the return to the school. So each learner had to choose a classmate to work with, and then every 5 tasks, they change pairs just to ensure that weaker learners could also benefit from more advanced ones. So these two contrasts were alternated across tasks, and then the 20 tasks always included 6 monosyllabic and 6 disyllabic minimal pairs, and each lexical item was targeted 5 times throughout these 20 tasks. So learners perform, as I said, 20 dyadic problem-solving tasks, which were always preceded by a pre-task and followed by a post-task or language focus, following this Willis model in 1996. So pre-tasks were used basically to activate topic-related words and phrases, expose them to a model of conversation, and also to prepare them for the task cycle. So what I did was I first presented the topic area of the session through a full screen photo of a real life activity. For example, a girl packing her clothes. And then I asked them about their experience doing that activity, and we engaged in a brainstorming. So then I help students recall and activate words and phrases that were going to be useful during the task cycle. And then students listened to a conversation that replicated the task that actually learners were going to carry out during the task cycle. So they listened for overall comprehension, and then they had to pay attention to the pronunciation and the meaning of the minimal pairs, which were inserted in this comprehension activity to focus on form. So I'm going to play it so you can get an idea.
Hi, Luster. Should we pack up together so we only bring one bag?
Yes, I have a very warm amber jacket, which will be really useful in London.
I prefer the umber jacket you have. I hate the amber colour.
Okay, that's fine. Could you bring cups and bags?
I agree that small bags may be really practical, but I'd rather not bring cups as they take up too much space, and we can buy them there.
Shall we bring bags and caps for the sun then?
Sorry, did you say caps? I meant cups.
Oh, sorry, I didn't understand you. Finally, would you add a plastic gun to play with?
I don't think that's appropriate. We may have problems at the airport. We could bring jam for our host family.
I'd love to, but jam contains liquid, so I'm afraid we may get stuck at the security check.
Right, so we did this listening activity, and finally, the very last task of this pre-task, in this one, I just showed an illustration of the target object on the screen, and I elicited the word, and as a form of feedback, I would give them the orthographic form of the word, and also they could listen to the pronunciation.
Bag.
So.
Bug. Cap. Cup.
Like that. So this was a way for them to receive feedback. So this is another way, another example of a pre-task. So in this case, the teacher elicits topic-related words and phrases about the topic of traveling. Then he or she can read sentences which contain these confusable minimal pairs, and then you can finally read a text out which contain these difficult to distinguish forms, and then create a comprehension activity. So during the task cycle, learners had the chance to use the words that they had been exposed to during the pre-task. So first I handed out a task pack, and this contained the written instructions of the task, the conditions and target items in the format of small cards, and then a game board for student A and B. I also hung on the blackboard a flashcard like this, illustrating the target vowels phonetic transcription and an example, and then the drawing of the mouth articulating the vowels, so that they could just use it as extra pronunciation help if I could not be there monitoring their productions at all times. So in the case of a communication breakdown, learners were encouraged to exaggerate their pronunciation instead of using hand gestures. So the 20 problem-solving tasks involved sharing information in order to reach one possible solution. So in this task, each pair had to agree on different items to put in one shared suitcase, but they had to take into account several preferences. Now, learners were not able to solve the task if they did not produce the phonological contrast distinctively, as the target words were made essential. They were made task essential. So this was a student-led phase. So in here, I tried not to stand too close to the groups so they could freely engage in the conversation unless there was an important communication breakdown. And then in the planning stage, students were asked to orally discuss the outcome of the task and rehearse what they would say in front of the class. And here I gave them feedback on the pronunciation of the words, and I also helped them express what they wanted to say. And in the very last stage of this task cycle, in the report stage, some of the pairs presented the outcome of the task to their classmates, and we compared the results. So I encourage all of them to participate and also to reflect upon their pronunciation. So here is another task that follows TBLT principles. In here, learners have to choose the best destination, an activity to do for the summer. So places and activities contain the target L2 vowels, and we give them several conditions so that they need to follow them in order to complete the task successfully. And the last phase of the framework was the post-task, or the language focus. So where learners were ready to consolidate what they had been practicing through a revision of those phonetic forms. So there were two stages. In the first one, learners examine and discuss the pronunciation of the target words that they needed. And then in the second part, in the practice stage, learners carried out more meta-communicative tasks, so which actually checked if they could perceive the L2 vowel contrast. So these tasks range from dictations, creating dialogues, to drawing objects, playing bingo, inventing a rap, etc., etc. Another possibility is to ask learners to record themselves during the task cycle, and then they can listen to their own recordings in the class or outside and evaluate their performance in terms of comprehensibility, accentedness, accuracy, and also resolution of the task. So to sum up, in the pre-task, students shared experiences and engage in a brainstorming about the session topic, which was, for example, packing a suitcase or going to a restaurant. And then they were exposed to the target phonetic forms and meaning through native recordings. Then during the task cycle, learners practiced the pronunciation of the target words in a holistic manner in pairs. They rehearsed their spoken reports, and then they presented them in front of the class so I could give them feedback on their pronunciation. And finally, the post-task served as an opportunity for them to consolidate the target phonological forms through conscious raising activities. They could make connections with other untargeted words, and we all reflected on the perception and the production of those specific phonological features. So to examine whether learners had improved the perception and the production of the target vowels after doing the tasks, they did an ABX discrimination and a delayed sentence repetition task. So first, students had to decide as accurately and as fast as they could whether the last word in the triad, for example, cap, contained the same stress vowel as the first one, cap, or the second one, cup. So the test consisted of 120 trials, 96 experimental trials testing the contrast, and 16 control trials testing vowel contrast, which did not pose any kind of difficulty for learners. And they were presented in 4 possible orders. Furthermore, 12 target minimal word pairs were trained, 12 were untrained, and the target response was always produced by a different voice that they had not heard before. So we analyzed the average correct responses and also the reaction time. So in terms of production, learners were asked to read a sentence which contained the target word. They listened to it, they wait for a beep, and they had to repeat it. So this test consisted of a total of 68 trials, 64 tests, and 4 practice trials. And the testing stimuli belong to 48 words coming from minimal pairs. And in addition to this, 24 minimal pairs were trained, 24 were untrained, and all these sentences were distributed into 2 randomized blocks. So the vowel measures we took were F0, F1, F2, and we extracted them manually from the target words, and then I converted them from hers to barks to minimize gender and vocal tract differences. And we calculated Mahalanobis distances, which are distances in standard deviations between a point, that is a given token, and the mean or the centroid of a distribution between non-native vowels. So for example, the production of one ash compared to the centroid of the distribution of wedge, and the other way around, and also Mahalanobis distances between native and non-native vowels. So the production of a non-native ash to the production of a native ash. So finally, learners engaged in an interactive task that was similar to the ones they were doing during the treatment. Here I calculated a rate of LRE production, language-related episodes. So the number of pronunciation-based LREs that they engaged during conversation. So for example, did you say cap or cup? And here, I obtained this because this would show instances of phonetic form awareness during communication. So as for the results, all these analyses were done through GLMMs. We set a random slope for time by subject, and here we added group time and vowel as fixed factors. So the results of our ABX discrimination task showed the main effect of group, a main effect of time, and a significant interaction between group and time. So pairwise comparisons revealed that whereas the experimental group got significantly better at vowel discrimination from time 1 to time 2, the control group did not. In fact, their performance in vowel perception decreased a little bit, but not significantly. So interestingly, these learners generalized their perceptual learning to untrained voices and untrained items. And also they maintained this knowledge 2 months after the treatment. And the same picture showed for response times. So the results of the delayed sentence repetition task show that only learners from the experimental group got better at distinguishing these 2 confusable vowels of the 2 contrasts, as the distance, as you can see here, from pre to post test increased, and they kept separating them at the delayed post test by showing this significant interaction. Moreover, only those learners that had undergone TBPT instruction produce the vowels in a more target-like manner at time 2 and time 3, as the Mahalanobis distance between the learner and the native vowel got reduced over time. So they were getting closer to the native model, whereas the control group remained the same, or they worsened slightly, but again, not significantly. So in fact, these 2 Mahalanobis scores correlated significantly, meaning that larger distances between the target vowels actually corresponded to smaller learner native speaker distances. So the weakness of the correlation may be indicating that there is large inter-learner variability, which could be explained by a myriad of factors. So importantly, production of target vowels generalized to untrained voices and items, and this happens similarly for both vowel contrasts. Moreover, learners who had been doing communicative tasks during 7 weeks engaged in many more language-related episodes per minute at time 2 than learners who had not participated in the intervention, suggesting that these tasks actually raise learners' awareness about the distinctiveness of these vowels that were embedded in these minimal pairs. So overall, this study sheds some light on the potential of task design and task manipulation to induce a focus on phonetic form during meaningful interaction. It also showed that generating a linguistic focus through task-essential language led to an improvement in the perception and production of segmental features of English. And through task essentialness, learners had more opportunities to reflect on phonetic form, as shown, as you can see, by the increased number of pronunciation-based LREs over time. And last but not least, interactive tasks may bring benefits not only for L2 pronunciation, but also for grammar, lexis, and pragmatics, and they can be easily integrated in a realistic instructional context, such as a secondary school in Barcelona. So the second research question of my study explored the effects of task complexity on L2 pronunciation learning. So for this, we divided the group into two. One group did cognitively simple tasks, and another group did cognitively more complex tasks. So these groups were comparable in terms of demographic and also their linguistic background. And task complexity was operationalized following the cognition hypothesis by Peter Robinson, that is, tasks from the simple group included less reasoning demands, hence conditions to consider, than those from the complex group. So according to this theory, increasing the cognitive demands of the task along resource directing dimensions, which are these ones, and controlling for resource depleting or resource dispersing dimensions leads to more accurate grammatical and lexical structures. However, we don't know what happens with pronunciation. We don't know if this theory also holds for L2 pronunciation. So the results in terms of perceptual discrimination of the target vowels showed no differences between simple and complex groups at Posttest, but it is true that learners who perform cognitively more complex tasks seem to distinguish contrasting vowels to a greater extent at Posttest. Also, the improvement from T1 to time 3 depended mainly on the vowel and a little bit on the group. So the simple group did not improve significantly the discrimination of EE and AA, the ash wedge, from time 2 to time 3, whereas the complex group got significantly better at the discrimination of ash wedge. A very similar picture emerged for production. So learners from both groups became significantly better at producing the vowel contrast distinctively, as shown by the increase of vowel distances. And they did so in the expected direction. As you can see here, the distance between learners and native speakers reduced over time. Nevertheless, it seems that the complex group here kept reducing this distance in vowel production in the delayed post-test, which is 11 weeks after the intervention. Concerning the number of pronunciation-based LREs, both experimental groups produce many more pronunciation-based LREs at time 2 after receiving pronunciation instruction through tasks, many more than at time 1, as you can see. No significant differences arose between simple and complex group between time 1 and time 2, meaning that they more or less engaged in the same number of LREs by minute, but the complex group kept producing more at time 3, suggesting that as time went by, they were still focusing a lot on phonetic form, and they were aware of these pronunciation challenging features. So what we could conclude here is that manipulating tasks along cognitive complexity and task essentialness directs learners' attention to phonetic form, and this results in more accurate perception and production of L2 segments in the long run. And especially between groups were found, and especially this difference between groups was found in time 3, so in the delayed post-test. Also, learners develop phonological awareness over time, as shown by this increased number of pronunciation-based LREs. And finally, Through an online questionnaire after the intervention, learners shared a feeling of improvement in English pronunciation and vocabulary, as well as they commented on their increased confidence when communicating in English. Finally, I would just like to briefly mention other techniques that have been used in subtitling studies to enhance the focus on pronunciation, but haven't been very explored in TBPT yet. So very recently, our Barcelona L2Speech research group has conducted a study with undergraduate learners to assess the effects of task complexity in completely meaning-focused tasks. Unfortunately, I cannot share any results yet, but we will in the New Sounds 2022 conference that this year is happening in Barcelona. So we'll have to wait until then. Nevertheless, I would like to share with you a little bit how our methodology was built and what kind of materials we used. So the dinner party task, which I adapted from Adams et al., consisted of a monologic task where students were the organizers of a party and they had to consider a seating arrangement at a party which had been initially designed in a way that would not work. So they had to justify why. And then in the second part of the task, learners had to come up with a new seating arrangement, taking into account the personality traits, the profession, and the hobbies of those 6 characters so that they could engage in pleasant conversations, and they had to give as many reasons as possible regarding their choice. So this task was preceded by a pre-task where learners learned the meaning of the words through a listening comprehension activity. And then task complexity was operationalized along reasoning demands. So in the simple version of the task, learners had to arrange these 6 characters in 3 different tables, and they had internally more coherent personalities. And then in the complex task, they had to arrange characters who had more complex, more incoherent personalities in 2 different tables. So our initial predictions were that in the absence of a focus on phonetic form, the increased demands of the task may actually lead to a greater lexical and grammatical accuracy, but development of L2 pronunciation is unlikely to take place because this is happening in meaning-oriented communication. So probably they would prioritize meaning. So as I said, the CAF and also the acoustic analysis are now underway, but I hope I can tell you the results soon. But in a follow-up study, we could ask ourselves, how can we draw learners' attention to L2 pronunciation, to L2 phonetic forms, while keeping the communicative nature of this task? So one technique is through input flooding. So this is designing tasks whose stimuli contain many of the phonological features that your learners are struggling with. In this case, for our learners, 2 vocalic contrasts and also the initial vowels, voiceless stops, sorry. So this can be done with any segmental or suprasegmental feature of the second language. And a second technique is through input enhancement, that is highlighting the target sounds so learners can notice them and learn them through spontaneous communication. So instead of having this, for instance, we could highlight the critical sound features such as the wedge in English, or instead of having this, we could highlight the tense E, which is very difficult for our learners. So to finish with, overall, our study showed that task design features and task complexity can exploit cross-language differences at the phonetic level as a means of raising learners' phonological awareness of crucial differences between L1 and L2 phonological systems. Our findings indicate that TBPT effectiveness in helping learners produce more distinct realizations of 2 vowel contrasts also leads to more target-like productions in a meaningful communicative context. Secondly, it showed that it is possible to adapt the design of features and assessment methods of HBPT to TBPT in instructional context. So this will provide very accurate measures of vowel contrastiveness, thus quantitative and qualitative distances between contrastive vowels. Also, it is recommendable to elicit spoken speech through informal, spontaneous conversations, and at the same time have some controlled production with high quality recorders, if that's possible, because in this way we can obtain precise measures of phonetic and phonological development. And finally, I think this study showed that longitudinal studies and a delayed post-test is needed to evaluate the effects of pronunciation instruction over time. However, there is still a lot to be done in this field. So we need more TBPT studies that not only target segmentals, but especially suprasegmental features, and that also test changes through listener ratings. We also need to keep investigating on how task design and manipulation can actually promote pronunciation development. And finally, explore the effects of computer-mediated tasks for authentic speech input and exposure during interaction, and take into consideration several learner factors that may affect gains in L2 pronunciation learning. So before closing this seminar, I would just like to share with you some tools and resources that I find very useful as a teacher of a second language pronunciation. For example, the TBLT Bank is a fantastic repository full of tasks where you can actually filter by focus type. So grammar, pronunciation, you can choose pragmatics, and then find lesson plans and printable materials for your classes. And they are also very active on Instagram and Twitter, so you can you get easily notified when they're uploading new materials. So some of the tasks that I have been talking about today are now available there, and you can find the teacher guide, student materials, as well as information about the target proficiency level, the recommended age, and also the appropriate instructional context, amongst many other task characteristics. So this is really recommendable for TBLT practitioners. So this is, for example, one of the tasks that I uploaded on the TBLT Bank, which can be used in class on how to give directions, for example, and it can be adapted to different proficiency levels. And at the same time, you're working on pronunciation. And finally, Kazuya Saito and colleagues are developing an SLA speech tools website, which will contain plenty of research as well as teaching tools that have been validated for foreign language learning. So this website will be launched towards mid-end of February, and it is now under construction, but if you want, you can take a look and you will find many pronunciation focused communicative tasks. There is also some explicit instruction activities and also some TBPT tasks that are ready to be used in the classroom. So I would like to thank all of you for listening. And once again, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Kate, for your kind invitation. And now I'll be very happy to hear your comments, your question, and also to get to know a bit about your experience when teaching pronunciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mora-Plaza, for such an interesting talk. And now it's the time for questions, and we already have one here. It says, in DSR, to what extent do we know that learners' production accuracy could be isolated from their perception accuracy of those vowels, as it sounds like they listen and repeated the stimuli? Right.
So thank you so much for this question. I don't know to whom I am addressing, but thank you. In this task, learners had to read the sentence. Then this sentence would disappear. They would have to wait for a beep sound, and then they would have to repeat it. The fact that we put this beep sound there was was for learners not to repeat from sensory memory. So we gave, if I'm not mistaken, around 1,500 milliseconds. So this would allow us to check whether they actually could produce those vowels inserted in the target words in the sentence in the context of a sentence. Now, it is true that this could also be assessed through a more global measure, through, for example, comprehensibility ratings or accentedness ratings, and this is something that I'm planning to do in the future. But the fact that I think we're avoiding this repetition from perception is by inserting this pause there. And it has been shown in other research and in phonetic training experiments that this kind of avoids repetition from sensory memory.
Okay, thank you. And there is another question here. Did you use peer feedback during the student presentations to enhance noticing of target sounds?
Right. So is this person referring during the task cycle, Josh?
Let me see. Yes.
Right. So during the task cycle, yes. So learners, the only feedback that they received was from me when they were doing the oral presentations, when they were first rehearsing and then doing the oral presentation in front of their students. However, they did not receive any kind of peer feedback, or I haven't been able to actually looked into the recordings yet. So all these conversations were actually recorded, but I haven't been able to go through them. So I am unaware a little bit of whether, you know, more proficient learners were actually providing feedback to weaker learners. I guess so, but I have to look into this data in detail. But they did receive feedback from me while rehearsing the presentation and also during the final oral presentation in front of the class. So in a way, yes, I guess this is one of the weaknesses of this design, that of course, since this happened in a very natural context, in a communicative, purely pedagogical context, it was very difficult, you know, that these pairs would receive native-like feedback. This can only be done, for example, in a lab setting where one of the pairs can actually receive feedback from, for example, a recording, right? Or we can pair non-native versus native speakers, right? But this is impossible in the context where I was doing this experiment. But absolutely, feedback is very, very important.
Mm-hmm. There's another question here. It says, how do you think we can structure instruction or develop training programs to address pronunciation? Should there be pronunciation courses, or should pronunciation be addressed in other courses?
Right, this is a difficult question, I would say. I would say pronunciation should be integrated in those courses, definitely. The thing is, there are different, you know, as I have presented, there are different methods, different instructional techniques to address pronunciation, which should be given to provided to those professionals, and then they should be able to actually choose which kind of approach they're going to take, whether they go for a more explicit or more communicative. Sorry, I don't know if I answered what this person was looking for, or I can talk to that person directly.
Okay, let's see if there are any other questions.
It would be also, sorry, go ahead.
There is, one person says, I'm curious about the process and details about your longitudinal study. How do you carry out the CAF research in terms of students' L2 pronunciation?
Right. So for this study, I did not take any CAF measurements. This is something that I'm going to do in the future when I am able to analyze all those productions that happen during the intervention. But this is something that we, at the moment, we're analyzing in our L2 speech research group. So with the very last task that I presented, we are taking measures of CAF, and we're gonna analyze both complexity, accuracy, fluency, and at the same time, pronunciation accuracy in terms of acoustic measures and also in terms of more subjective measures. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, it looks like there are no more questions. So this brings us to the conclusion of today's webinar, Applying Task-Based Language Teaching Techniques to Second Language Pronunciation Learning. A special thank you to our presenter, Dr. Mora-Plaza. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today.